Hello.
Hi, how are you this morning?
I'm doing good. Our first podcast. I'm a little nervous, but we're going to jump in.
I'm a little nervous too, but we got this.
We got this. So, we are two seasoned psychotherapists, both of us working in the field for 10 years.
And we wanted to do this podcast about breaking the schema that we psychotherapists are somehow perfect or fixed. So, this idea of being perfect therapists is unhelpful and even problematic because it creates a dynamic of us being these somehow perfectly solved and evolved human beings helping the so called, unfortunately, mentally ill.
So, in this podcast, we're going to show why it's actually important to be seen more as a wounded healer than a perfect psychotherapist. Because we both struggle. And instead of that being a bad thing, we want to show how it's useful for us being good and as good as we are in our field. The wounded healer motif is about breaking this stigma of mental health meaning that we're fixed or we're perfect. But first, who are we?
Yeah, I'll dive in first. So I'm a non-binary queer person. I've grappled with identity and sense of self throughout my life. Growing up in the 90s meant that my sexuality and the question of whether people like me should have rights and or protections was being debated all around me, on TV and at the voting booths. And this informed a lot of my approach to therapy, that I'm not seeking to fix others or to fix myself. Rather, I really want to be able to support people to be as authentically them and as self-loving towards that true self, as complex as it might be, as possible. So, what that means for me is that not only is this work really personal, but it's also incredibly important in informing the way that I approach therapy. Um, and through the training that I received at the University of Edinburgh, what I really learned is that the therapeutic relationship engaged with authenticity and self-awareness to support positive growth, that's the thing that really makes change for clients. And so this podcast comes in part out of this experience of noticing a big gap in new therapists' training that leads to them maybe not doing as much of the important work about self-awareness and being in relationship and experiential learning so that it becomes difficult to address when their own stuff comes up.
Ryan, I'm going to want to talk to you about that later on in this podcast. That feels really important and kind of juicy, but thanks for sharing that.
Juicy.
Yeah. My name's Dr. Jess Erb, and you wouldn't know it to look at me because I'm bubbly, confident, very blonde. But I've come from a childhood of pretty abject poverty. Food banks on Fridays were just a normal thing for me growing up. And I also have come from a family of a lot of physical and emotional abuse and familial trauma, both generational and in my lifetime. For me in my 20s, I tried to pretend I was okay, but for decades now, I've been in therapy myself to make sure that I have healed as much as I can from this. And we'll talk about healing as well in this podcast. But because of that, I specialize in trauma and abuse with my clients. I feel like I can understand the depths of what my clients are going through in an intuitive way, not in spite of what I've gone through, but because of it. It's because of this past that is actually vital to my work. It informs the therapist that I am. Because growing up with therapists that were overly professional or somehow had this idea of being above me generally meant I wouldn't trust them. Now in my practice, I'm incredibly real. I'm goofy, I swear. And I do that knowing that for someone like me who's grown up in abuse, being able to see who you're actually talking to and really understand them rather than just a professional, that's what matters. And so for me, this understanding of like being able to be myself really matters. But I still come up with clients constantly saying, I probably don't understand what they're going through because I must have come from a perfect home. And as much as I won't necessarily talk to them about that, it does make me realize that there's something going on even for clients where when they see us in the room with them, they probably would never guess that we've gone through some of the things that they've gone through.
And then another member of our podcast that may interrupt us at times
Oh,
is
yeah.
Maggie. Um, that's Jess's dog and Mercurial Monster.
Maggie's a very fluffy white Samoyed. She, generally speaking, when she hears me talking, she'll want to jump up and be acknowledged. So bear with us. We've just added her as a podcast member. So, one of the things that we can tell you about that we didn't just now is that we each have over 10 years experience, that we've trained at a top university in the UK, and that we've trained other psychotherapists for years. We could say that we're highly published, that we have books out. We can talk about all of the things that make us great, the conferences we've presented at, the people we've shaped. And this is true, but it doesn't show the importance of what happens in the therapy room and how we use ourselves to be the very tool of change for others.
And that really is what this podcast is all about. Showing how therapists aren't okay, perfect, solved people, but rather we are messy, we're human, we struggle with life just like you and everyone you know. And that is why we are good at this work, as Jess was saying earlier.
So, Ryan, I have a couple questions for you based on what you were saying before. Do you agree that there is a big schema that therapists have solved all their problems or that we're perfect? Like we've felt it, but do you actually think this is an issue that other psychotherapists listening or even clients listening would agree with?
I do. I do think that there really is kind of that impression of what a therapist is. I think we see it show up in pop culture media. We've seen more complicated and nuanced portrayals of therapists in recent years. But still, I have that experience that you referenced earlier too, with clients saying like, "Oh, you wouldn't understand," or I don't know, like if you really have fights with your family or something. I'm like, well, of course I have fights with my family. I'm not some transcendental human being.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that that really is a big thing, and a place where I notice that come up is clients and therapists both doubting the meaningfulness of what they're experiencing in therapy by saying like, oh, you know what, this isn't real because you're like you're perfect, you don't understand me, and that is a way that sometimes people end up discounting the growth that they're experiencing and or the work that they're doing.
Hmm. Say more about that. Like how might that discounting actually happen for clients?
I think that that shows up in kind of wanting to reject us as inauthentic. As like,
Okay.
oh, you're just saying that, or you don't actually know what it's like. Um, and I see that on the other side with trainee therapists and experienced therapists as well, thinking like, oh, well, you know, that's like, I don't really know how to help you. I don't know how to fix this. I don't have the answer. And a lot of it is wrapped up in this whole idea of answers and then the concept we have of people possibly being solved, as we've said, like having every issue, every concern, every behavior fixed.
The interesting thing about you saying that, and I was thinking about this as you were speaking, is that like when we were thinking about doing this topic, I had a lot of my friends who are seeing a therapist um push back at us for wanting to do this podcast. For
Mm.
them, they were like, Jess, I need that veneer. I don't want you to spill the trade secrets. I need you guys to be perfect. If I think you have problems too, why would I trust that you're going to help me? And I started feeling like, is there a necessity to this schema? Can I ask you that? Like, what do you make of that?
Hmm. I do think that there is some necessity in it not being about the therapist or in it not being about always defaulting to, oh, I've experienced the same thing. Because
Mm.
while I have struggled with many things and had many, painful experiences in my life, as we all have, I'm not going to be able to relate to every client and the details of their story. Or I may have had a similar experience and had a totally different kind of outcome from it. Something that one person experienced as traumatic, I may not, and vice versa. So I do think that there is an importance to making all the room for the client. And I don't think that the schema is what does that. I think the thing that really does that is therapists being self-aware and vulnerable so that they can clock when they're like, "Oh, I wanted to say something that was going to make it about me."
Mm.
And I held that back. And important to train therapists for me. I don't know why I said that like Yoda. It's
Important to train therapists like me. Why did they give Yoda an
my
accent?
God, because I did it out of order. Anyway, all right. It's important for me to train therapists to really think about that kind of self-disclosure question of, is this for me or is this for the client? Will this help the client in their healing and or their journey? Or do I just want them to know for selfish reasons? I get it.
So there's kind of this aspect of breaking this schema matters because it allows us to kind of be real and vulnerable, and we don't have to put up this professional kind of barrier. But it's not about being someone that is just going to share all my stuff. Like, this is the first time on this podcast that many of my clients will have learned about my past in this particular way. In the room, they may wonder why I've done this work. And I'll say, I've also experienced trauma. It usually stays there, it stops there because it's not about me. It allows them to kind of have an understanding and honest answer, but I'm not going to go into what. I'm not going to talk to them about my own life because being able to still know that I can hold them means being able to have a certain level of awareness of how to keep the session about a client. And that's what you're kind of saying is fundamental. Therapists need to know themselves. They need to recognize how to use their past, but they have to recognize that in order not to allow a client to kind of become therapist.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. I think that that really is that fundamental difference, that the nuance that we're getting at with this. Yeah. Jess, could you tell me a little bit more about how you've seen psychotherapists kind of fall into this schema?
Absolutely. I think both old and new therapists fall into this. I think with therapists that have been around for a while, life hits us. Like, being a psychotherapist does not mean that we no longer like have things that kind of have a curveball in our lives. So some psychotherapists that have been around for as long or longer than myself that I'm supervising, they might ask the question of, can I be a couples therapist now that I'm going through divorce? Like, can I still do this work when I've failed in my own personal life? How do I navigate talking to clients when I've lost my dog that's always been in the therapy room? How do I not get triggered by that? Should I ignore that fact? How do I talk to clients? So it's almost like this aspect of like the personal and the professional can get really blurry because psychotherapists often have this veneer that they need to have had a perfect marriage in order to be a couples therapist or even be married or be in a long-term relationship, as if the credence of being able to be really good at what they're doing means that they're welcoming other couples, let's say, as my example, like into health and like a better relationship. Um, and so for me, that's been a really interesting question that psychotherapists that have been around for a while that kind of know this work struggle with. It's almost like they take their personal life, and some of the struggles they have in there and then forget how good they are at their job generally. And so they don't know what to do with that kind of dissonance. And I think I wanted to start with that one because we often think that once you've become a psychotherapist for a long time, you're kind of just good at what you do and you don't have any struggles. And I think we can fall into that ourselves, that complacency we can get in our field of being like, yeah, I got this. I think that for new psychotherapists, it's interesting depending on what program you do. In ours in Edinburgh, vulnerability was huge, right? You got really top
Yes.
marks in University of Edinburgh. If we how did they say it usually? Like if we bleed onto the page, if we're very vulnerable, if we kind of show ourselves. But then I noticed when I started training in Edinburgh, how many psychotherapists immediately forgot that when they entered the room with clients, that they wanted to seem capable, that they wanted to seem that they had it all together. And they'd often be like, I have to make the correct response. I have to be super impressive. I have to, from the get-go. And even in Canada, now that I've been supervising a lot of students, there's this aspect of like, how do I impress the client? How do I look like I have everything solved? How do I not seem like someone that might be kind of nervous or not together? Or psychotherapists that have had a past that they might have written about in papers. Well, they might have written about anxiety, but now that they're a psychotherapist, they can't tell anybody they have anxiety or they can't tell anybody they suffer with depression. It's almost as if once the psychotherapists are out of training and into practice, some of the very things that they might have written about to give them self-awareness have to now be overshadowed by the work of them as a professional.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, I definitely see that, like that kind of sense of anxiety. It's a professional anxiety about like doing things right. And I
Mhm.
really especially have noticed that what you shared about therapists wanting to like, oh, how do I answer? What's the right thing to say? I hear that from people all the time. It's like, oh, I spent, the whole time my client was talking, I was thinking about the right question to ask them. Like, okay, so you stopped listening to them. Um, because I think, especially with the degree to which we've kind of been as a field ushered into the medical model,
Mhm.
that means that answers and results are expected in a different way.
Mhm.
But in my perspective, being a therapist is it's really about a way of being with people.
Mhm.
I don't need to fix my client. I need to help initiate the process so that they can find the healing that's right for them
Uh,
from within. So I think that is what, when the anxiety falls away, when you're welcomed into this more vulnerable way of training, this more relationship focused kind of way of training, everything can fall away and it just becomes about how do I be with this person in the way that most helps them.
yeah.
And when I reflect on my own work with clients, some of the times that I messed up the most in terms of some sort of professional veneer were some of the most magical moments. I even
Really? Tell me
think
more.
about, yeah, I kind of want to share an example
Yeah,
of
do it.
there was a client that experienced themselves as, or were told by their family more that they were a monster
Okay.
because of the way they were reacting and treating people.
Mm.
And I had really, I had thought about that in between sessions and because we think about our clients in between sessions
Mhm.
and came back and I was like, I really kind of want to say like, so, what if you are a monster? Like, what does that mean? If holding boundaries makes you a monster, what does it mean to kind of be the monster?
Yeah.
And this was not like a novel thought for the client. Like they had
Okay.
kind of already thought about that. And I
Yeah.
I in my own time thinking about it, I thought like that's hot shit, Ryan. Like you're gonna rock some worlds with that. And so I said it not once, but three times before
Literally
my
made this
client
reflection.
said, I heard you. And we had the best laugh ever and just laughing at me. And I was like, wow, I just really thought I had something incredible to communicate, didn't I? And being able to be vulnerable and accept that, like, wow, I just really put my foot in my mouth, made a fool of myself. it was an incredible relationship building moment and also a moment in which the client was able to own their own empowerment and feel like, yeah, actually, I'm there.
Yeah.
Not because Ryan told me, but because I'm already on this process and on this healing journey myself.
There was nothing you were saying that that client hadn't heard themselves, but they could almost like level the playing field by just being like, Ryan, I get it.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. So when I think about that, I'm like, okay, like that is the kind of like openness and vulnerability that means it's not about our perfect answer.
yeah.
It's about being with the client.
And that kind of ties back to what you were saying before about like, it's not about us not having any issues or about any of that. It's about being with. Being your therapist is not okay is about like, we don't have to be perfect. It's not about being perfect. And both personally, but also professionally, that actually being able to be vulnerable is one of the key ways of being a good therapist.
Mhm. Yeah. And I'm kind of curious about something you mentioned earlier in the podcast and how we can kind of tie this into what we're talking about now.
Okay.
Um, You talked about some of the friends you talked to when you were planning this podcast, and we were starting to talk about that, saying that they need the veneer. And that's kind of just led me to wonder, like, let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on the ethics of our approach, how we can do this well.
Yeah, we have spent close to a year now figuring out our why, trying to figure out like, and it's because of these comments, I think. Like,
Mhm.
this is not about disparaging therapists. You and I are so passionate about what we do. We train therapists, we're interested in it. It's not about trying to throw people under the bus or tell secrets or undermine therapy or therapists. It's simply about being a good therapist means that you've done the internal work, that we've gone to the depths so that we can help those around us to heal. And I think that's our fundamental reason for this. And so for us, I want us to lean on that aspect of the Jungian wounded healer. So Carl Jung wrote about decades ago about this understanding of a wounded healer, that it is the wounded leading the wounded, and it's through that that healing happens. And when I think about Carl Jung's understanding of the wounded healer, I think that's where our why comes from. For me, it's not about like, let's throw us under the bus, because that's completely antithesis to what we want to talk about. It's about what are some of the veneers of even the understanding of mental health? Like, why is health meaning fixed? I'm not fixed. And I think for me, the definition I have for mental health is that it's not about being perfect. It's about understanding why we do what we do. For me, when I think about the rewiring work I've done or some of the ways that my defenses kept me really protected and defended against people understanding my past. I spent years trying to look like I had things together because to open up that meant that I would be the only person in my university that I knew of that would have been dealing with this or had that kind of home life. I had years of defending myself that now I've let go of. And when I notice myself going back to it, mental health is not, I'm not fixed, I'm not solved. It's what happened here for me to go back to an old pattern. For me,
Mm.
that's the definition of mental health I can hang my hat on. It's not about being fixed, it's not about being perfect, it's not about being solved. It's about recognizing when we go back to something that might have been an old pattern because it's no longer unconscious or something we're not thinking about. It's something that we're so aware of and we can tend to it and further our exploration. So for me, I think the ethics of doing this podcast is starting to answer questions from clients, starting to allow an openness into our practice, starting to allow therapists to be like, oh, yeah, I hear you. That actually is true. And for you and I to start to do what a lot of therapists don't do, which is being vulnerable ourselves to be able to open up the floor or like the space to be able to have conversations. So I think that's something that I'm really really excited about. So
Mm,
clients, if you're listening, we have an Instagram, Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Ask us questions. We'll be answering them. We want to be able to start to dive into, I would say, Ryan, like, what are some of the things that you think your therapist is too unapproachable to ask? What if we could be approachable? What if you could ask us? And what if we answered you honestly?
absolutely, yeah. And we want to be able to engage in those conversations and kind of help people think about, what makes therapy good for them, and help therapists think about the kind of therapist that they want to be. And so it's about just these supportive conversations that are an invitation to have a more maybe holistic understanding of what it is to be a therapist and what it is to grow and heal in terms of our mental health. And I don't want to give the impression that we have the answers, right? Just as we're trying to say we don't have the answers in therapy, our answer is not going to be the same as every experienced therapist answer. We
So
don't speak for the field. We're speaking for ourselves and for our experiences.
that's so true. I love that you just said that. Yeah, this is a Ryan and Jess take on this. We're
Mhm.
pretty awesome, but we will not have all the answers.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So, um, that feels like kind of the summary today that we wanted to give of um, basically our mission statement. What is this podcast going to be about, and who are we?
Yeah. We'll be talking about therapists and mental illness. We're going to be talking about some of our questions of like, how do therapists think about their clients? What happens when clients want to be friends with their therapist? We're going to be talking about relationship. We're going to be talking about if we think about you. Ryan already spilled the beans. We do. We're going to be talking about all the different ways in which we think about AI, about self-help books, about how we actually navigate the ways of being a therapist with all the complexities of vulnerability. And maybe along the way, we'll be answering as many questions as you want. So we're kind of open to this podcast. Um, I would say shifting based on your questions too. To like, we have an idea of where we want to go, and it's up to you to also bring us wherever you want to go.
Yes, this will be a much, richer and more engaging kind of podcast, since we're hoping to be able to be responsive to our audience. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks for tuning in to episode 1, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to our support team. Denise Danda and Una Grace are our marketing team for Centered Self, and we can't do it without you. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too, at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.